Blinmann. I'm the director of the Office of Archaeological Studies of the Museum of New Mexico, Department of Cultural Affairs. And they want me to always include the Department of Cultural Affairs, so I do it. Anyway, this is I guess this was inspired by a question and answer thing that I did at the History Museum a couple weeks ago. And William asked me to come by and just talk about turkeys locally, because turkeys are part of Pindi, the Pueblo, and they're, so I'm going to run through this reasonably quickly, we'll see. I always start with this, which is our only claim to being scientists in archaeology is because we intend our stories that we tell to be criticized. We can't prove anything about the past. We can only create models, interpretations, things for the next bright graduate student, or the next clever archaeologist, or the next site like LA2, or the portion of LA2, to inform us about corrections or even falsifications of things that we think are true today. Turkeys are part of the picture of the ancient Southwest in many, many ways. So they're worthy of conversation in and of themselves. We tend to think of turkeys only in terms of Thanksgiving and upcoming and all of that juicy fat that we get to have, especially those of us who like dark meat. But turkeys were far more than that in the context of a non-modern culture. We find the bones being used for all kinds of things, whistles, flutes, awls, like all of these things here. These are all out of Pindi. And probably the most important resource of the turkeys in ancient times, however, was the feathers. And in fact, we find more evidence that people were raising turkeys than we find evidence that people were eating turkeys, if we look across the broad expanse of the northern Southwest. And the idea of using turkeys for feathers is an odd one, but in the modern Pueblo world, they get used in prayer sticks. They're incredibly important spiritually. Most arrows are fletched with turkey feathers. Before the bow and arrow was introduced, spears were fletched, especially the nice long symmetrical tail feathers. Incredibly innovative use of turkey feathers. These are snow boots or mucklucks made by taking the flight feathers of turkeys, wrapping them around that yucca fiber cord, and then looping a sock on a plated yucca leaf sole, so that you actually have a water-resistant snow boot. And it isn't like there's one of these, that this was an artifact that was made. You can see them up at Mesa Verde. This one was put on display at the Hurley Museum. But again, innovative use of turkey feathers. But probably the most important use of all was in blankets. The downy body feathers of turkeys are long and wonderful, and when wrapped around, this is a sample of the nice, perfect blanket feather. When you wrap those feathers around a yucca fiber cord, you get a boa, and you take this boa and you warp your loom with it, and you have this incredibly rich downy blanket. And so you can feel that, get a sense of how incredibly warm it is. But the blankets call for 10,000 turkey feathers. And even though they're a lifetime blanket, they take several months to make. So they're an incredible investment. And when Coronado came through, and actually this is one where the insects have eaten most of the down off the blanket itself. it should look like that, but now you can just see the strings, basically, that make it up. But when Coronado came through, one, in the accounts remark on flocks of turkeys being kept by the Pueblos they encountered in the Rio Grande Valley, and also his winter supply train never made it. His winter supplies were stuck on the boat in the top end of the Gulf of California, and so he's here in New Mexico without winter supplies and confiscating blankets from the Pueblos to keep his men warm, but you don't replace a turkey feather blanket when it's stolen without planning for those 10,000 feathers for every single blanket and the 2 months it takes to make it. So confiscating blankets was probably a matter of life and death to many of the Pueblo peoples, or certainly was an incredible inconvenience, and made that first winter for the Pueblos really, really difficult. What brings turkeys to mind today is all of the advances in genetic studies. And that's finding its way into archaeology as well as Ancestry.com. And because native peoples are not all that keen on letting us do destructive analysis on human bones, a workaround for some archaeologists has been to collaborate in studies of turkey and dog genetics to try to track migrations through tracking the movement of the domestic animals that are associated with human communities. And that's what hit the news a couple months ago in a big way. And basically using mitochondrial DNA from dogs and turkeys to try to track human migration. This was the first study of its type. It needs a whole lot more work. They didn't have enough dogs that they could get the turkey on to make that a meaningful study, so they just focused eventually just on turkeys. And the idea is that they had a whole bunch of turkeys from, let's use the pointer, from up in the southwestern Colorado area, and a whole bunch of turkey samples from down here, but not including Pindi, and not yet including LA2.
LA2.
LA2 is...
Go ahead, Eric.
It's the schoolhouse site right down here.
At the water tank.
Yeah.
And all about.
Yeah.
And all of that.
And all over the place down there. It's underfoot, but there,
There.
in a big way.
What water tank, by the rec train?
Yeah.
Yes.
So, Agua Fria Schoolhouse. So, they have a scatter of turkey remains from here, and a whole bunch of turkey remains from up here, and the conclusion of the study is that there are two different varieties of turkeys, genetically, between the two areas. That the Four Corners variety is present with deep time depth, and that Four Corners variety replaces the northern Rio Grande variety late. And it's interpreted as evidence of a late migration from the Mesa Verde region into the northern Rio Grande, and specifically in the eyes of one of the researchers, Tewa. I'm not a big fan of this researcher. This is his model, and he touts the turkey DNA as supporting a mass migration from Mesa Verde to the Tewa Basin as accounting for the modern Tewa, basically meaning that the ancestors of the modern Tewa were the people who lived in Mesa Verde. I don't believe that for a second. In part because Scott Ortman, who's formulated this, he's acting like a prosecutor. And a prosecutor, if there isn't a defense attorney, can convict anyone of anything by simply finding the right evidence and running it in a line and taking the jury through this nice little story. But it's the defense attorney's role to say, well, no, wait a minute, there's this other line of evidence. These other models can account for the same thing. And that's sort of what I'm doing. And so the questions I'm asking of their data is really, what are we going to learn as soon as they look at mitochondrial DNA from turkeys from this whole area, from Chaco and all the points south. And when you think of road networks, when you think of architecture, when you think of pottery, when you think of trade and exchange, the area from here all the way up, you know, from Gallup to Dolores is integrated into an entire cultural system. So if there's a really, really neat variety of turkey that produces wonderful feathers up here, it's probably going to be down here as well. There's no reason for it not to be. But until collections of turkeys have their DNA analyzed from down here, we won't know. So when they fill in this hole in terms of turkey genetics, then we'll know whether this line is correct or whether we have multiple lines bringing in this variety of turkey into the northern Rio Grande region, or even what's the variety of turkey out here in the plains, you know, what were they using down in the middle Rio Grande. All of those questions are unanswered until we broaden the sample. And just to claim that this is true, you know, rubs me the wrong way. In part, again, this is another quick way to summarize it. During Chaco, we have a stylistic sphere which is singular and basically connected within that group. We know that this style does not extend into the Albuquerque area. We know from architecture and everything else that everything above La Bajada is after 8900, they're not participating in Chaco. They're getting, you know, we don't have outliers, we don't have roads, we don't have any of that stuff up here. And we know that the ancestors of the Amos people are just violently opposed to Chaco, creating a marvelous sort of Maginot line of defensibility in there. So it's, I can easily see how an early variety of turkey persists here, different from the variety of turkey that is present all the way through Chaco. But Chaco as a central place terminates with the droughts of really the early to mid 12th century. And when that drought hits, it's like New Mexico in recession. We lose all of the capital outlay funds. You know, every little community is just hanging on by its teeth and hoping that it can repair its own potholes rather than, you know, the interstate connections. But anyway, the central functions and implications of Chaco Canyon really cease, you know, by 1130. And the drought is encouraging everybody to move around. And what we see is people from the southern San Juan Basin are going into the Rio Puerco south of Cuba, they're going into the Rio Jemez, they're pushing toward the Rio Grande. And all of this is happening before 1200. And right at AD 1200, when we did the archaeology at Cochiti, we could actually watch them hop the Rio Grande. And it happened sometime between 1200 and probably 1210. And from as soon as they were across the Rio Grande, they scurried their way up the Santa Fe River, they went up the southern Palomino Plateau, they went up the Galileo Creek, and in fact, using indented corrugated pottery, which was made over there but never was made here during Chaco times, by tracing that indented corrugated pottery, we find sites all the way across 285 in the Galileo Basin. that look like they're this population that is sort of herniated into and displaced the existing populations, which were probably ancestors of the people that Sandia and Isleta. And then as we move deeper into what's called the Pueblo III time period, if you're up in the Four Corners, or into, you're at the threshold of the coalition period here in the northern Rio Grande, all of this just sort of is accentuated. We've got people from Arizona going all the way down to the Mexican border. We have site unit intrusions of Mesa Verdean people that we can identify by distinctive pottery, scattered all the way from actually canyon lands, sort of the wrong way Corrigans of the migrants, all the way down to Truth or Consequences. But we don't have any other than the Rio on the east side of the Rio Grande yet. We may find them, but we don't have them yet. The reason I say that we can track Mesa Verdean peoples is by the time they leave Mesa Verde, they've got this incredibly distinctive design style, while the contemporary folks in our part of the world are nowhere near as deeply invested in this banded, formalized layouts. You know, it's really a distinctive design style that we have here locally, and these are examples of Galisteo black on white from Pindi. And here's Pindi. And Pindi and its turkeys are represented by turkey pens in one of the plazas, and the pens continue through time with the remodeling and rebuilding of the Pueblo. And the initial guess dates for it are the late 1200s. So basically, the initial construction of these pens are before the migration of Mesa Verdean peoples. But then they overlap the movement of Mesa Verdean peoples. And what would be great is to know what variety of turkeys were in these pens. And for whatever reason, no, they weren't included in the DNA studies, whether they just couldn't pry the bones out of the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, or they just didn't have any appropriate things preserved in the collection. These are images from the report on the turkey pens, just these little enclosures. It's really pretty simple to keep a turkey around. You break its wings and keep it from flying. You give it food, and then it doesn't necessarily want to leave. And so you can build up turkey supplies. And I just learned that you've got tons of turkeys at
Lots of turkeys.
the schoolhouse site. So the turkeys here, right here in Agua Fria Village. My bet is before 1150, they're probably the northern Rio Grande variety. But with the movement of peoples from the southern San Juan Basin, with this post-Chaco migration, they probably brought with them this distinctive Four Corners variety. And that they introduced that variety into the northern Rio Grande before the Mesa Verde migration, and it spread there. So what we need as archaeologists is really precise dating of turkey samples in this very sensitive AD 1100 through 1400 time period, and trying to give the geneticists a much better sample to work with, not to mention trying to come up with turkey samples from potential source areas down south of Chaco Canyon in the southern San Juan Basin. And that's that. It's too large a group to pass this around, but if anybody wants to, actually, I'll stick around. I won't run home quickly, so I'll stick around, and so when everything's said and done, we can.
So are there still any turkeys around?
Are there turkeys around?
I've seen one.
turkey genetics have been totally screwed up by stocking of turkeys, bringing in varieties from different parts of the country. But turkeys are all over the place. You know, you talk to hunters who are, I'm trying to think, how many of you are turkey hunters? Anybody? Yeah. So where does he hunt?
Hyde Park, Pecos, wherever.
See, Hyde Park, Pecos,
Chama.
Chama,
Romesa.
Romesa.
MS Mountains.
Yep. So basically, they would have been, the wild versions would have been much widely distributed. And there's a cute little article in American, I think it's in American Antiquity years ago, where entitled "Who Domesticated Whom?" where the seasonal rangers up at Mesa Verde started to put out corn to attract the wild turkeys around their residences, and then after the turkeys got used to coming around their residences, they wouldn't leave. And so they couldn't get rid of the turkeys. So.
Where was this from, Eric, that shot there?
That actually is from Hovenweed. That's one of the springs where there's some really, really nice white clay handprints on the back of the wall. So there's not much connection other than, you know, it's a nice.
It's really cool, yeah.
And you wrote the article for El Palacio with Stephen Post.
Oh yeah, on Pindi.
And some of the pictures of the pottery there had turkeys on them. I was surprised about
Turkeys, you know, turkeys are, again, incredibly important. And I don't know how much they are for food as opposed to pets or domestic animals to be plucked. And you don't have to kill them. If you want feathers, you just pick them up, stroke them, calm them down a little bit, and then just start to
We
pluck.
got some bird turkey. It actually looks like they were being
Eaten.
eaten, but we also had,
Burials.
no, clutches of turkey eggs.
Oh, so sweet.
And of course, they're all
Clutches of turkey
turkey
eggs.
eggs. Like we'd find 2 or 3 broken turkey eggs on some surfaces. Most of the time, we got just like lots and lots of turkey eggshell, but we had this one place sitting outside on an outside surface, and it had 3 eggs that were sort of piled on top of each other. All of the pieces had all been crushed and stuff. But, and then Robin Cordero had those painted turkey eggs down at the Alameda site in Albuquerque. So they used them for everything.
Yeah.
Not only to eat, but yeah, everything else, and tools.
Yeah.
All kinds of turkey bone
So
tools.
when you dug up over by LA too, what you're calling it, and you dug up that area, what you found were turkey bones and those
Got lots
bones
of
that
turkey.
And what else did you find?
Oh, all kinds of things, but we'll talk about that when Eric's done with this.
I'm only one ring of a 3-ring circuit.
We're gonna do slideshow.
Oh, you're also gonna do something?
Yeah, we're gonna do
Oh, okay.
slideshow.
Yep. So
Okay. Thank you, Eric.
thank you.